is both a reinscription of stories, but it's also a gesture that cuts the city and makes you think of the material qualities of that immaterial material that you were talking at the beginning. That's what, for us, was important. The tactical here is actually what people do in space. The tactics is them inhabiting and walking the space in ways perhaps that we did not expect.
Thank you so much, Julian, for very insightful, really participatory, actually, architecture, or actually. So I think, thanks for stirring up our imaginations, and I'm sure many of us will want to ask some questions. So maybe we'll gather 3 of them. First you, then the gentleman behind, and a third one over here. Yes, I'll
Visų pirma, aš noriu padėkoti už labai įdomų, labai informatyvų pranešimą. Mes labai dėkingi ir labai daug žmonių atėjo į tokią nuostabą paskaitą. Dabar sakoma, tas, kas neturi praeities, neturi ateities. Kitais metais Europa minės 100 metų, kai prasidėjo Pirmas pasaulinis karas. 100 metų tai labai ilgai. Kokią nuomonę apie tą memorį, atsiminimą? Ar reikia tokias datas minėti, kaip pranešėjo kokią nuomonę? Ar tai svarbu ir kodėl tai svarbu?
Thank you. Gentleman behind.
Okay. First, I'd like to dwell on the notion memory, since memory is something that we ourselves remember. But as I can see, well, no one here remembers, for example, Second World War, or very few people remembers the time when Lithuania was part of the Soviet Union. And since every political wing that comes to power tries to make history well, more comfortable to the aims of this or that political party, there may be some discrepancies in those memories. Well, I can give you dozen of examples, but in order to save the time, I won't. One additional question is, as I was watching your presentation and I was listening to you, I suddenly felt that your idea, your concept, could have been misunderstood by the local, well, people of African descent in Nantes, in France, in total, and taken the discrepancies between the white and the black inhabitants of France. I want to ask you if your concept, if your monument was not taken as, okay, we beg your pardon that we were rude to you, we beg your pardon that we made you slaves, now we apologize and au revoir, à bientôt, this is the Quai of Loire, and okay, you go back to Africa. Thank you.
Okay, and the last one before.
Actually, thank you very much for this presentation. And as people nowadays tend to be less religious, most of sacred places such as churches and or synagogues change their functions. So, for instance, in the Netherlands we have bookstores or sport halls or hotels instead of these places. And what do you think, what's your opinion about it, and how these places should be transformed? Thank you.
So if you can respond now, Joel, and more selectively.
Let's do it a bit in order. In respect to the First World War, question that I appreciate the comment that Gediminas is an explanation of the question. I apologize that I did not speak in full, but I'm moved by listening to it. I think that events in history have marked who we are. All the events that happened, from slavery to World War I, to the Holocaust, to the Civil War in the United States, to the desaparecidos in Argentina, all of those have marked, conditions of contemporary life. But I'm interested in turning a little bit around the question and the use of the word memory. And perhaps that has not been clear, or perhaps I have not explained it clearly. I'm interested in this notion that memory as an action has to do with the present and has to do with the future. I'm interested in thinking that memory is not memorial. And it's not the same. Memory includes the celebration of a meal, the ritual of, of a feast of St. John or New Year. We remember who we are because we also celebrate with festivals. We remember other things than atrocities. Yet, those atrocities, as I said before, have marked our existence. So how to commemorate the First World War? I don't know. I really don't know. I do know that it would be interesting to get lots of people talking about the meaning of First World War, in Europe, and not only in Europe. That doesn't mean to build new memorials in the First World War. Perhaps we don't need that. Perhaps we need a series of significant events that would bring people on different generations to talk about the past, as you suggested. People do not remember because they didn't live it. Yet, there's something interesting here to consider. The fact that I did not live through kind of the fight for independence in Lithuania doesn't mean that I cannot try my best to understand. But I cannot live it. And this is an important thing for any kind of memorial project. Empathy, and this is what I tried to say about representation, that goes with the meaning. Empathy is one of the most important human emotions, one of the most significant ones that connects all of us. Yet, I cannot have your experience. I cannot speak to you for your experience. We can talk about your experience and my experience and other experiences, yet I cannot pretend to know what happened to you or to someone. That means I cannot speak for you. And this is what I was saying at the beginning, or many times. We cannot speak for those who suffer. We can try to understand and we can invite those voices to be in our spaces. It's one part. So I don't know what to do with World War I. Yet, it would be great to invite multiple conversations about its meaning. In regards to the question of, which is similar to the fight for independence in Lithuania. Perhaps I can only relate because I remember myself marching in Buenos Aires to regain democracy in 1983. Perhaps I have that sense and I can envision or imagine what happened in Cairo. Because I saw photographs of them marching and I remember what happened to me. But perhaps new generations who have not encountered that condition have not seen it. But it's important not to judge, call it new generations, because they didn't have those experiences. They have other experiences in life and they can make this world better. Many times because they didn't suffer those traumatic stories. I think new generations have the opportunity to do better things in the world, as we probably did better things than our parents in many cases. In regards to what you asked about NOT and the kind of African and Caribbean community, which I think is a very significant question, I'll respond in two ways. The whole process took about 14 years. Let me just go back for a moment. 1992, Nantes opens up an exhibition in the city of Nantes that is called Les Anneaux de la Mémoire, the Shackles of Memory. Very significant exhibition. 500,000 people saw it, throughout about a year. It was going to be a temporary exhibition, but such a demand to keep it, brought that to the front. Where many groups organized, organizations of African descent, descendants from the Caribbean colonies. Remember that also, there's the Haitian Revolution, which is significant in all the struggle, and we don't pay much attention to that, but it was one of the most important revolutions in the world, and because it was kind of a revolution of slaves fighting not only for their own freedom, but to become citizens. So it was an incredible model, of struggle. And I invite everybody to read about the meaning of Haitian Revolution, because it's very significant. This is not a memorial that tries to apologize for the past. On the contrary, it's a memorial that has taken 400 meters of the city to suggest that the struggle continues. It was a memorial that was discussed with many groups, including other groups from African descent and Caribbean descent. It was a memorial that was somehow developed in conjunction with a comité de pilotage that included more than 25 different groups in conversation, and historians and political activists and people from government and people from the city. Of course, there were voices against it, but many of the voices against it were actually what you could call the right-wing side that does not want to think about its own history and its own crime, at least there. That's what they said in Nantes. We got letters in the newspaper against the memorial. For example, I remember one that they didn't want to show Christophe and myself because they wanted to protect us, very respectful, but it said, "J'irai pisser à ton mémorial." What does it mean? I'm going to go piss at your memorial. Well, public space, invites this. And we welcome this because it's agonistic. Non-violent, yet we can debate. That's the invitation of these kinds of spaces. Part of the question and the critique is also connected to the lack of images. And I just want to mention that because you mentioned this, Caribbeans, and may connect to what you were saying before. The presence of the body in chains is part of the cliches and the myths of representation of slavery all over the world. One of the most significant persons that was very happy to see none of this here was François Vergès, who was the president of the Committee for a History of Memory of Slavery in France. She's from Réunion. And she was very pleased with this idea that there's no specific representation, because this invites other ways of thinking about it. But we receive criticism from artists who work with the idea of a representation of the body and the suffering of the body. And we understand that that's a critique that is a valid, call it a very valid aesthetic critique to the memorial. Yet, the moment this memorial begins, if we included lots of images, it would be a space full of images and not a space empty so that you can occupy and you can think. One of the most significant things that I learned about this project is the value of emptiness. The value of large space and the value that the city paid for an enormous project that has almost nothing. Think about that. That's the value of this. A curator of a historical museum will probably go nuts and will try to fill every single piece of wall with stuff. You know what happens. And I know that because I've worked in historical museums as well. So what are the strategies? And that connect to representation. So what will happen in the future? I'm not sure. This has not been taken as a memorial that apologizes. Further, we had a conference about a month ago, and the creators of the memorial in Martinique and creators of other memorials in the Caribbean came and were moved and fascinated by the idea of the empty space that we're proposing here. And they are people who are living in Martinique, who created the very significant sculptural memorial, more figurative memorial. And we established a great dialogue about this. As to the last question, or the question you're asking, I'm open to more questions if you want. the question of reuse. Throughout history, we have seen lots of structures being reused. And I think one of the most sustainable ways in which we can think about the world is reusing structures. Structures that may not have the use that they had before. Again, that doesn't mean desecrating churches or synagogues or other, or other structures. But I'm interested in the continuity of life. Thinking that cities invite life as a continuity. They are not frozen in time and in moment. I don't think that, call it heritage or historic preservation in cities means just cutting, and freezing the moment, a moment in history. If not, we wouldn't have a certain kaleidoscope, of life. Of course, I think in dialogue. So if we establish a new modern building, new contemporary building in the middle of old historical fabric, we need to learn about how we can work with historical fabric, but yet construct modern buildings. It's okay, it was not mine. If it was beer, oops. So to me this is an important question. But I would like to consider that history needs to continue.
Okay, we'll take 3 more questions. So one from you, one from Laima, and someone else at the back. No, there's someone at the back. Here, maybe over there. Okay, so first you, and then
So I would like to ask for your comment about the one Lithuanian object. You saw it talking about 4 Soviet sculptures over one of the bridges of the Vilnius River Neris. So in the context of that remembering and memory of history, would you, and there was a debate for a number of years about those sculptures, should they stay or should they be removed? So what would be your opinion on that?
second from last.
So, in a way, I will continue this because these sculptures were used in different ways in artistic projects. Gediminas Urbanas used putting mirror cubes on one of the sculptures, and Lithuanian Mailing used the 2 pictures of 2 workers for the cover of one of them of their publication, and it was a scandal. It was really banned from selling. And I really like your idea that we should not commemorate only the past, but to think that, for example, slavery continues today, and it's really horrible. And that's what it's interesting to me, how really to deal with those problems which are actual now. And we also have this public space, I would say, public space in Lithuania is somehow trashed by political short side, or how to say, short side, because like Mayor of Vilnius always wants to rule who has a right to march in the Gediminas Avenue and who has not. And today they decided that they will not allow gay parades to go to Gediminas Avenue because of certain political things which were not important all the years before. So I don't know, just some things about contemporary.
And the final.
I just remember the question that was raised, I think, 4 years ago, and it's related with the sculptures on our Green Bridge, as it's like passed from the Soviet Union, and those symbols, do they represent ideological things, or do they represent a part of our history? Like, I don't know how to say, just part of historical memorial. Is it a function of historical memorial, or is it symbols that represent the ideology that we refused after independence? How should we look at those symbols?
Yeah, I can add.
I'd like to reverse the question. I'd like to ask you, what do you think?
I'm a journalist, I can have an opinion.
Okay, journalist.
Of course you can.
That's fine. I'm an architect, and I have an opinion. But I don't know if I have an opinion about what to do with the bridge. You know.
You had one.
What did I say?
Well,
Oh yeah.
we were passing a few times, and Julian suggested let's exaggerate, right? And so instead of having these sculptures cut like mushrooms and remove the Gruta Parkas to the mushroom king, you know, who collected all these monuments in Gruta Parkas, let's bring them back and put all of them on the Green Bridge. You know? So instead of like trying to remove and erase past, let's exaggerate. You know? Let's put all of them, you know, there. All of them there on the Green Bridge. You know? Through this act, you know, what we would do, you know, we would kind of like speed up, you know, the time on one hand, right? On the other hand, we would really make this gesture, right, that we are not worshiping, you know, that we are not really kind of like trying to preserve. Maybe there are some other meanings, I don't know. I'm just trying to interpret your suggestion.
Okay. So, we discussed that. And it was a... Here's what I think. There's... One of the most difficult things is to deal with very difficult stories in using both play as a pedagogic and also a kind of a artistic means. Because play, many times, and I want to expand a little bit on this, play is many times not understood as historically based. This is what I mean by this. If you play with the past, you're making your own interpretation beyond history. And we know that the official history, I think you started with a kind of question of these monuments and these places that are sanctioned by official narratives, are based on projecting meaning over the past. This is where the ethics and historiography come to play in an interesting dilemma. On the one hand, historiography projects meaning over the past all the time. Tries to make sense of what happened, and then presents a narrative. Could be multiple narratives, but it's a kind of an interpretation of the past, historical base, all the documents, you know, all of that. But it does not respond to the ethical demand of the past. Because the past, the moment you project meaning over the faces of those who cannot speak, then you freeze the past as a sculpture, you know. What was that, Medusa? You know? You look at Medusa and you transform into stone. Yeah, that was a Greek myth, right? The moment you freeze the past, then you divest yourself from the responsibility of understanding that the past is here still to make us think differently. But new generations cannot address the past in similar ways because they did not experience that. So there's something about the pedagogy that I'm interested in here, pedagogical things, that have to do with play. This is problematic in many cases. For example, the story of the Holocaust is usually a narrative and is told, you know, you need to learn about the story, you know, historical means. It's perfectly important and fine. Yet, we cannot grasp some of those aspects because history is not enough. This is what I'm trying to say. So in this case, what we were trying to do was just a kind of a conversation with Nomeda and Deriminas, you know, in the car where we were driving, and you know, it just came to my mind as a play. What would happen, you know, if you brought 25 of those or 10 on each side of the sculptures? You know, I'm not sure if it makes any sense, but if we allow ourselves a bit of humor and a bit of play, perhaps we can demythify some aspects of the past that have been embedded in objects. And this is what I'm trying to say. The past is not the past because there's a figure of Lenin or Stalin or Videla in Argentina, the general, you know, who killed and tortured so many people. How can we demythify that? Perhaps we can allow ourselves to think humor and play. That doesn't mean not respect, because we're talking about ethics all the time. But it means to decontextualize both the bridge, and its narrative, and the park and its narrative. Could it be interesting? I have no idea. But that's kind of part of the response to the questions. In regards to the public space and the kind of marches, there is always a question about, who gets to speak in public space. In the United States, one interesting thing is what is called the First Amendment right. First Amendment right is the right to free speech and free assembly in public space. There's supposedly not regulations, but every city somehow regulates if you can have a march because you have to ask permission. Of course you can assemble, you can march, you can say whatever you want in public space. I don't know the circumstances here, but to me public space is agonistic. It's always about debate. It's always about inviting the voices of others. Even the others who we don't want to hear. And I want to emphasize that. Because one of the most difficult things we face in life is how can we listen to people who think differently than us? I don't want to hear those. They drive me crazy, right? You may have seen yourselves or think yourselves about that. At least I do. But that's the moment in which I know I have to make an effort and listen to those arguments that are, in my mind, ridiculous and doesn't make sense. Yet, they have the same right to speak that I have. So what do we do? To me, public space is the place in which that should be invited. So that was the...
Shall we take last questions? Last call?
One short comment.
I would like to ask.
Yes. First,
One short comment.
short comment and short comment from you. And then we'll wrap up.
How do you can handle the Greece of humanity? It's not difficult for you to go just in this direction and to handle all Greece, all planet?
Greece.
All the bad stories, all the bad emotions,
Yeah.
all the traumatic stuff. This is not too much for you to take in. Okay?
Because it's very difficult.
Very difficult to cope. And how are you coping with that? Second question from is
A short comment. Okay, a short comment is actually an anecdote, which I remember from my childhood still in the Soviet Union, but I'll bring it back to the present time. So two people meet, a Russian and American. American says, well, in Russia you don't have human rights at all. Well, we do have, says the Russian. Well, says the American, I can come up to the lawn of the White House and say, Obama is a fucking moron. Oh, that's nothing, says Russian. I can also come to the Red Square and say, Obama is a fucking moron.
Okay. You take it as an anecdote. And then
A question which is quite related to the others about the reflection and contemplation in the public places. When you talked about creating some memorials, you talked about the two dimensions, and you basically created hierarchy. Correct me if I'm wrong. Hierarchy. Correct me if I'm wrong. That the ethical dimension should be as a fundamental of some certain monumentals, and the aesthetic side should be secondary. And you talked about the idea that suffering should not be aestheticized because it closes the ability to contemplate. I want to ask you to unfold this idea a little bit more and ask a question why it is so, why it is that aesthetic side of the monument should be the secondary part, why we cannot provoke the contemplation in when the aestheticization of suffering is in front of you. Why you're saying that images are closing the contemplation?
That was for you, question.
No, it's fine.
Okay, we can both try to.
Yeah.
We can provide two different probably opinions.
Yeah.
Okay, so but the first question was how can you handle all the trauma? And how do you do that?
I don't know. I think it's a very important question that I ask myself every day. The first thing is because I feel that I have to do it, you know. But the second thing is that I know I have a privilege. I know I have a privilege. And the privilege comes from a family who cared a lot, you know, a family who escaped. You know, I said that autobiography is not the case. That I saw lots of things, but I always try to understand my position, perhaps coming from a country that thrives on psychoanalysis. I mean, I don't know if you heard, but Buenos Aires is the capital of psychoanalysis in the world. So, you know, everybody has not only one psychology, but probably two. You know, you know. But trying to understand, you know, our position as human beings, you know, for me, is important. And I don't feel that, although sometimes it's heavy, I don't feel that I'm Atlas, you know, carrying the weight of the world, you know, somehow it is suggested. I actually think of myself as more human by looking at these stories. Of course, there are moments in which, I mean, I'm not all day with this. Let me tell you a little bit more. I play soccer, football, and I'm a coach. And I coach soccer for my kids, you know, and I have fun, you know, and I love teaching, and I love helping people think about these stories. But I do it in a way that perhaps, if I was to say one thing that I've been learning about this, and partly the project in France taught me, we suffered a lot through this project in terms of its making and in terms of the cost and all that. And I'm very proud as an architect that we were able to reduce the original cost to 40%. Sorry, we reduced the cost 40% of the original cost. And if I tell you how much this thing cost, you would laugh. You know, not because it was locked. No, you cannot imagine. I'm sure you cannot imagine because it was.
Please tell us.
Huh?
Please tell us.
No. It's public,
not on camera.
It's public record. It's not, you know, it's public money. It's public record. It was less than 8 million euros for the whole thing. You know, 8,500 square meters of public space with 150 meters of underground dam construction with glass, you know, with all the lighting, sound, you know, all of it. So I'm very proud of that. The fact that we care for the resources of the city, and I was able to look at the line-by-line cost of things so that the resources are used properly, because to me that's part of the beauty. And it's a joy, even though it's difficult. And for me, what I try to do is to position myself again as a witness to the stories. Engaged witness, committed witness, but I'm not my grandmother, you know, who had to escape Berlin, and the only thing she talked about was the good times in Berlin. She didn't want to talk about 1933 to 1938 as a Jewish woman in Berlin. She didn't want to talk about that. And she instilled in me love and care, like my mother as well, who's a musician, and my father who's an architect. So I try to do the best. But I do it in a way that I hope it comes clear that we illuminate the past and the past illuminates us. And if you meditate on that idea, then the weight of the world that we feel in our hearts somehow can melt a bit. And bit by bit, if you do that more and more, you start to feel, oh, even though all this is happening, we can do better. And that's part of the task.
Thank you. I hope your all work brings humanity to their peacefulness.
And thank you for the question, because for me it's a very important thing. Not many times I'm asked the question on a personal level, and for me, because I'm here and I feel so comfortable, I very much at ease telling the story. in regards to the question of aesthetics, it connects to that point as well. I didn't say there should be no aesthetics. There's always aesthetic judgment. There's always a relation between what you could call the aesthetic pleasure. Yet I try to understand that at the service of that larger question, which is the ethical question. They are combined, they are connected, in terms of spatial experience. When we frame that space, and I saw that mother with a child, I felt the aesthetic experience that she had somehow was strong. And I didn't ask her, because who am I to ask her, what are you feeling? But I know that something happened in space. And I knew at that moment that this was right. At certain level. And to me, what happens when I see the intense representation of suffering as some of the sculptures that I show you with the San Francisco Memorial or the Miami Memorial, many sculptures you can see in concentration camps, I feel that there's a moment in which you cannot connect because the object is doing the memory work for you. You're just looking at something. And that something is not looking at you. So it's frozen. And that's to me part of the problem with, the attempts to represent the suffering of others. You don't engage. And again, someone can come and tell me, no, wait a second. There is an incredibly strength in the kind of a sculptural tradition, of representation. From Madonna, to paintings, to, and it's perfectly fine. I'm not judging that and saying, no one can do that. I'm not saying, no, there's no poetry after Auschwitz, which was very much misinterpreted by critiques, because Adorno didn't mean explicitly that. But it happens to me that the intent is to open up space so that memory can be perceived, memory can be enacted. It's not an object that you divest yourself, you put it in the plaza, and that's it. You call it the memorial, that's it. You walk, never see it again. I'm interested in that, but perhaps I'm interested in the moment that someone brings a flower to that object.
But don't you think that emotional connection disappears? And it's very important in some certain in the action of memory to feel some kind of emotions. And if only action is intellectual and based on reflection and contemplation and only like that, with no emotions, it's not fair.
Yeah.
I think that must be some sort of emotions.
And there are emotions in this space. There are the invitation to I think of yourself walking underground for 150 meters, next to the water.
Yeah, of course, it's difficult to experience from images.
But if you just extrapolate, you go out now and walk 150 meters. Try to close your eyes and imagine yourself in a space where you have the water, you have the sounds of the river, you have, water that is higher than your waist, and suddenly there is an emotional response. Because there's an invitation to an emotional response. Yet, emotion there, it also connects with reflection and action. That's the intention. I would never say there should not be emotions. On the contrary. But what I'm not interested either is in the theatralization of those emotions. Or the manipulation of those emotions to the limit in which you only see the architect manipulating your head and not yourself having an emotional response. And there are many memorials that try to do that. So, yes.
No, but also speaking about aesthetics, I think aesthetics here is precisely in the certain choice of the materials. And emotions here are also evoked by, by the presence of the coldness of concrete, or stone, which is there. And especially in the situations when in being close proximity to the large mass of water, like a river, right? It accumulates humidity, right? and it starts to be covered by kind of like, you know, all this running mist. Also motion is there in terms of specific acoustic in the space, you know, because that void, you know, creates certain kind of like, you know, sonic condition, right? So our senses, our bodily senses, you know, in that presence of these materials, right, are already being triggered, right? So the body senses, you know, not only kind of like visceral, not only kind of like something that can be triggered through the, you know, recognizable symbols, right? But here, all other senses of the body are being triggered. Right? So, well, I mentioned feeling of the humidity, you know, something like, even like, as one of your images suggests, it's respiratory, right, feeling, you know, something that you breathe into your lungs, you know, when you are in the humid, you know, in the humid vessel, if you like, you know, probably something that, you know, you could relate that people who were, you know, transported as slaves, you know, probably when they were in the vessels, you know, carrying that, you know, they probably also, you know, we can only speculate, right, you know, what they could feel. You know, probably we will never be able, and maybe this is not even the duty of this work, you know, maybe this is not the duty of any work, right? But you know, but we could kind of like, you know, speculate about those, you know, senses. You know? So this is the moment, you know, that our bodies are kind of like, you know, can you know, experience in these spaces, right? I'm not mentioning the light, and I'm not mentioning this kind of like reflections of the running water, you know, which is reflected in the specific kind of like, you know, surfaces, right, of concrete, you know, and glass. You know, even though the glass is intentionally made not reflective, so it can transpire certain kind of like notions, you know, as it discusses, and it kind of like, you know, collects, you know, references and meanings, right? There is something more that I wanted to say, I wanted to say about politics of the material, right? You know, because in each of these choices, you know, like each of the stone, each of the piece of kind of like concrete slab or the glass, they come with a certain, you know, labor, right? You know, so this presence of labor in every monument and presence of this material, right? You know, where this material is coming from. You know, I remember like when they built Gediminas monument in the cathedral square. I remember there was a line that the granite was donated by a friendly Ukrainian government, and it was from kind of like Chernobyl proximity, right? So it's still kind of like radiates. Probably if you would take Geiger counter and you would start to measure, you know, you would get a lot of beeps, you know. So for me, this kind of like, you know, politics of the material, where it comes, you know, and today we're getting more and more sensitive about it. Kind of like, you know, what was the labor used, you know, excavating, mining all that material, you know. So I think in that sense, you know, this, you know, these aspects, you know, and these aspects are aesthetic choices, and they are strong aesthetic choices, you know, stronger than kind of like probably, you know, these images or symbols for which this work kind of like, you know, very strategically refuses to deploy.
Okay, it's already 9 o'clock. I think we have to close it, and I thank you, Julian, for a very emotional and talk that made us empathetic with your work. And thank you very much.